This moment in Venezuela marks the end of an era. Let me take you back to July 28, 2024, not the date itself, but what happened that night in Caracas. Nicolas Maduro stood before a crowd of supporters, his voice hoarse but triumphant, declaring victory in Venezuela's presidential election. The National Electoral Council, stacked with loyalists, certified the results within 51.2% for Maduro, 44.2% for opposition candidate Edmundo González. The streets erupted, not in celebration, but in protest. Within days, the U.S. State Department, the European Union, and a chorus of Latin American leaders had rejected the outcome as fraudulent. The OAS called for new elections. The White House imposed fresh sanctions. And just like that, Venezuela was back in the headlines, another crisis in a region that has long been a battleground for great power competition. But here's this isn't just another election dispute. This isn't even just about Venezuela. What we're witnessing is the death rattle of an era, the unraveling of a global order that has defined the last 3 decades. And if you're not paying attention, you're missing the bigger story. I've spent the last 25 years studying the intersection of geopolitics, resource competition, and regime survival in Latin America. I've advised governments, written classified assessments for intelligence agencies, and watched as the same patterns repeat themselves each time with higher stakes. What's happening in Venezuela right now isn't just about Maduro's grip on power. It's about the collapse of American hegemony in its own backyard, the rise of a new multipolar order, and the dangerous miscalculations that come when empires refuse to accept their decline. And the mainstream narrative, the one you're getting from most news outlets, is missing the forest for the trees. So let's start with the official story. What are they telling you? The narrative goes like Venezuela is a failed state, a dictatorship clinging to power through repression and electoral fraud. Maduro, a former bus driver turned autocrat, has presided over an economic catastrophe: hyperinflation, mass emigration, collapsing oil production. His regime is propped up by Russian mercenaries, Chinese loans, and Iranian drones. The opposition, led by Maria Corina Machado and her proxy candidate González, won the election in a landslide, but Maduro stole it. The U.S. and its allies are now considering tougher sanctions, maybe even military options. The goal? To restore democracy, stabilize the region, and push back against Russian and Chinese influence. That's the story you're hearing. And on the surface, it's not wrong. Venezuela is a disaster. The economy has shrunk by 75% since 2013. More than 7 million people have fled the country. The military, once a pillar of support, is fracturing. The opposition did win the election. Exit polls, independent tallies, and even some government insiders confirm it. The U.S. is ratcheting up pressure, with the Treasury Department sanctioning Venezuela's gold exports and the Pentagon quietly repositioning assets in the Caribbean. But there's a problem with this narrative. It's incomplete. And in geopolitics, incomplete narratives lead to bad policy. Let me tell you what's really happening. First, the election fraud wasn't just about Maduro staying in power. It was about survival, his inner circles, and the entire Chavista elite. You see, Maduro isn't just a dictator. He's the frontman for a kleptocracy that has looted Venezuela for 2 decades. The generals, the oil executives, the crony businessmen, they've all gotten rich while the country burns. And they know that if they lose power, they're not just out of a job. They're facing prison, extradition, or worse. So when the opposition won, they icked. Not because they care about ideology, but because they care about their bank accounts. Second, the U.S. response isn't just about democracy. It's about control. Venezuela sits on the largest oil reserves in the world, bigger than Saudi Arabia's. For decades, Washington treated the country as a client state. Then Hugo Chavez came along, nationalized the oil industry, and started cozying up to Russia and China. The U.S. tried to overthrow him in 2002. It supported a coup. It imposed sanctions. It backed opposition protests. And when Chavez died, it thought Maduro would be easier to remove. But Maduro outmaneuvered them. He survived. And now, with the U.S. distracted by Ukraine and the Middle East, he's consolidating power in ways that would have been unthinkable a decade ago. Third, this isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the new Cold War. Russia and China aren't just supporting Maduro out of altruism. They're playing the long game. For Moscow, Venezuela is a foothold in America's backyard, a place to deploy Wagner Group mercenaries, sell arms, and remind Washington that it can't ignore Russia's global reach. For Beijing, it's about securing oil supplies and undermining U.S. influence in a region that was once considered an American sphere of influence. And both see Venezuela as a test case for how far they can push back against U.S. dominance. Now, let's talk about the geopolitical cant, because this is where things get really interesting. We're living in a moment of transition from a unipolar world, where the US called the shots, to a multipolar one, where power is diffused among multiple actors. The US still has the strongest military, the most dynamic economy, and the deepest alliances. But it's overstretched. It's bogged down in Ukraine, where it's spending billions to counter Russia. It's facing a rising China in the Pacific. And it's dealing with a Middle East that's more volatile than ever. Meanwhile, Russia and China are working together to erode U.S. influence wherever they can, whether it's in Africa, the Middle East, or Latin America. Venezuela is the perfect example of this shift. For years, the U.S. treated Latin America as its backyard. It overthrew governments in Guatemala, Chile, and Nicaragua. It backed dictators in Argentina, Brazil, and El Salvador. It invaded AMA and Grenada. But those days are over. Today, Latin America is a battleground for influence between the US, China, and Russia. And Venezuela is the most contested prize of all. Here's how the great powers are playing the US is trying to reassert dominance through sanctions, diplomatic pressure, and covert action. But it's running into two problems. First, sanctions don't work when the target has powerful friends. Russia and China are helping Venezuela evade them. Second, the US is losing moral authority. When Washington condemns election fraud in Venezuela but turns a blind eye to it in Honduras or Haiti, it looks hypocritical. And when it talks about democracy but backs Saudi Arabia or Egypt, it loses credibility. Russia, meanwhile, is playing a more aggressive game. It's supplying Venezuela with arms, intelligence, and mercenaries. It's helping Maduro crack down on dissent. And it's using Venezuela as a staging ground for operations in the Caribbean. The goal? To force the US to divert resources from Ukraine and the Pacific. To remind Washington that it can't ignore Russia's global reach. And to signal to other Latin American countries that Moscow is a reliable partner. China's approach is more subtle but just as dangerous. It's not sending troops or mercenaries. It's doing what it does, buying influence. It's investing in Venezuela's oil industry. It's providing loans. It's selling surveillance technology. And it's positioning itself as a neutral arbiter, offering to mediate between Maduro and the opposition, while quietly ensuring that any deal benefits Beijing. The message to Latin America is the US is a declining power. China is the future. Now, let's talk about the military dimension. Because this is where things get really dangerous. The US has been quietly repositioning assets in the region. The Navy has increased patrols in the Caribbean. The Air Force has conducted more surveillance flights. And the Southern Command has been running exercises with regional allies. The official line is that this is about countering drug trafficking and illegal migration. But anyone who's studied U.S. military doctrine knows that these are the same moves that precede larger operations. Here's the military intervention in Venezuela would be a disaster. Let me be clear about this. I've seen the plans. I've read the intelligence assessments. And I can tell you that the hawks in Washington who think this would be a quick, surgical strike are delusional. Venezuela isn't Iraq. It's not Afghanistan. It's not Libya. It's a country with a battle-hardened military, a population that's deeply divided, and powerful external backers. If the US invades, it won't be a cakewalk. It'll be a quagmire. The Russians will supply Maduro with advanced air defenses. The Chinese will provide intelligence and economic support. And the Venezuelan people, even those who hate Maduro, will rally around the flag. And let's not forget the regional reaction. Brazil, Mexico, Colombia, they're not going to support a US invasion. They'll condemn it. They'll cut off cooperation. And they'll move closer to China and Russia. The US will end up isolated, bogged down in another endless war, and weaker than before. But the military option isn't the only one on the table. There's also the possibility of a negotiated transition, one where Maduro steps down, the opposition takes power, and the US lifts sanctions. The problem? Maduro has no incentive to negotiate. He knows that if he leaves, he'll face prosecution. And his inner circle won't let him go quietly. They'll fight to the end. So what's the most likely outcome? A prolonged stalemate. Maduro stays in power, but his regime becomes even more repressive. The economy continues to collapse. The opposition fractures. And the US is left with either accept a failed state on its doorstep or double down on a strategy that's already failed. Now, let's talk about the domestic political dimension. Because this isn't just about Venezuela. It's about American politics. The Biden administration is under pressure to do something. The Republicans are accusing it of being weak on Venezuela. The Florida vote, critical in a tight election, is demanding action. And the foreign policy establishment is pushing for a tougher line. But here's the US doesn't have good options. Sanctions haven't worked. Military intervention would be a disaster. And diplomacy is deadlocked. So what's the administration doing? It's playing for time. It's imposing targeted sanctions. It's supporting the opposition. It's hoping that something breaks its way. But time isn't on its side. The longer this drags on, the more entrenched Maduro becomes. And the more desperate the US gets, the more likely it is to make a mistake. Let me lay out the scenarios. Because this is where things get really interesting. Scenario: the best case. Maduro steps down in a negotiated transition. The opposition takes power. The US lifts sanctions. Venezuela holds free elections. The economy stabilizes. The refugees return. And the region avoids a major crisis. This is the outcome everyone wants. But it's the least likely. Maduro has no reason to negotiate. His inner circle won't let him. And the opposition is too divided to govern effectively. Even if Maduro leaves, the military will still control the levers of power. And the US will still face the same: a broken country, a hostile military, and powerful external actors. Scenario: the most likely. Maduro stays in power, but his regime becomes even more repressive. The economy continues to collapse. The opposition fractures. The US imposes more sanctions, but they don't work. Russia and China increase their support. And Venezuela becomes a permanent crisis, a failed state on America's doorstep, a haven for criminals and terrorists, and a battleground for great power competition. This is the scenario we're heading toward. It's not pretty. But it's the most probable. The US will try to contain the damage. It will support the opposition. It will impose sanctions. But it won't be able to change the fundamental dynamics. Maduro will survive. The country will continue to deteriorate. And the US will be left with a mess it can't fix. Scenario: the worst case. The US intervenes militarily. It doesn't go well. The Venezuelan military resists. Russia and China increase their support. The region turns against the US. The war drags on. The economy collapses. Millions more flee. And the US is left with another endless conflict, one that drains resources, undermines its global standing, and emboldens its adversaries. This is the scenario that keeps me up at night. It's not inevitable. But it's possible. And if the hawks in Washington get their way, it could become a reality. Now, let's talk about the bigger picture. Because this isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the decline of American power. For the last 30 years, the US has pursued a strategy of liberal hegemony, trying to remake the world in its image. It's intervened in Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria. It's imposed sanctions on Russia, Iran, North Korea. It's tried to spread democracy, free markets, and human rights. And it's failed. The world isn't becoming more democratic. It's becoming more authoritarian. The US isn't more secure. It's more vulnerable. And its adversaries aren't weaker. They're stronger. Venezuela is just the latest example of this failure. The US thought it could overthrow Maduro. It thought it could install a friendly government. It thought it could control the region. But it was wrong. And now, it's paying the price. So what should the US do instead? First, it should accept that it can't control everything. The era of American hegemony is over. The world is becoming multipolar. And the US needs to adapt. Second, it should focus on diplomacy, not coercion. Sanctions don't work. Military intervention is a disaster. The only way to resolve the Venezuela crisis is through negotiation, one that gives Maduro a way out, protects the opposition, and ensures a stable transition. Third, it should work with regional partners, not against them. Brazil, Mexico, Colombia, they have more influence in Venezuela than the US does. If the US wants to solve this crisis, it needs their help. Fourth, it should stop treating Latin America as its backyard. The region is sovereign. It has its own interests. And it's tired of US interference. This isn't a popular argument. The foreign policy establishment wants to double down on the same failed strategies. The hawks want to escalate. The politicians want to score points. But the reality is the US can't fix Venezuela. It can only manage the crisis, and even that will be difficult. Let me leave you with this thought. What's happening in Venezuela isn't just about one country. It's about the end of an era. The era of American dominance. The era of unipolarity. The era of liberal hegemony. We're entering a new world, one where power is diffused, where great powers compete, and where the US is no longer the sole superpower. And if we don't adapt, we're going to keep making the same mistakes. The question isn't whether Maduro will fall. The question is what comes in, and the answer to that question will shape the next decade of global politics. So pay attention. Because this moment in Venezuela isn't just the end of an era. It's the beginning of a new one. And the choices we make now will determine whether that new era is one of stability or chaos. Now, what most people don't realize is that Venezuela's collapse isn't just a regional crisis, it's a military inflection. The Pentagon has spent the last 2 decades treating Latin America as a secondary theater, a place where drug interdiction and counter-narcotics operations could be outsourced to local proxies. But the reality is that Venezuela's implosion has turned the Caribbean basin into a contested zone, one where great powers are testing the limits of American influence in ways we haven't seen since the Cold War. Let me explain why this matters. In 2019, when Juan Guaidó declared himself interim president, the Trump administration's response was a mix of economic warfare and bluster. They imposed crushing sanctions, froze Venezuelan assets, and even flirted with the idea of a military intervention. Remember the infamous "all options are on the table" rhetoric? But here's the uncomfortable: none of it worked. Maduro didn't fall. The opposition fractured. And the country's military, far from defecting en masse, dug in deeper. Why? Because the calculus of power in Caracas isn't just about ideology, it's about survival. The Venezuelan armed forces, the FANB, are not a monolith. They're a network of factions, some loyal to Maduro, others to Diosdado Cabello, others still to the shadowy figures who control the country's gold and oil smuggling routes. What keeps them together isn't love for the regime, it's fear. Fear of prosecution, fear of losing their privileges, fear of what comes in, and that fear is reinforced by a simple: the US has no credible military option. Here's the data. The last time the US seriously considered intervening in Venezuela was in 2018, when then National Security Advisor John Bolton famously scribbled 5,000 troops to Colombia on a notepad during a press briefing. But the numbers don't add up. Venezuela's military, despite its decay, still fields around 120,000 active duty personnel, plus tens of thousands of militia members. The country has Russian-made S-300 air defense systems, Sukhoi fighter jets, and a network of coastal radar stations that could make any amphibious landing a bloodbath. And let's not forget the Wagner Group's footprint. Reports suggest that Russian mercenaries have been training Venezuelan special forces since at least 2019. Now, some will argue that the US could rely on Colombia or Brazil to do the heavy lifting. But that's a fantasy. Colombia's military is stretched thin fighting the ELN and dissident FARC factions. Brazil's armed forces, meanwhile, are in the middle of a political crisis of their own, with Lula's government deeply divided over how to handle Venezuela. And even if they wanted to intervene, neither country has the logistical capacity to sustain a large-scale operation. The last time Brazil led a regional military effort was in the 1965 Dominican Republic intervention, and that was under a U.S. security umbrella. So what's the real military game here? It's not about invasion. It's about deterrence. And that's where things get interesting. Russia and China have been playing a long game in Venezuela. Moscow has sent military advisors, sold billions in arms, and even deployed nuclear-capable bombers for training exercises in 2018 and 2020. Beijing, meanwhile, has turned Venezuela into a testing ground for its debt trap diplomacy, using oil-backed loans to extract concessions and gain leverage over Caracas. But their real goal isn't to prop up Maduro, it's to create a permanent foothold in the Western Hemisphere, one that can challenge U.S. dominance in its own backyard. This is where the geopolitical stakes become clear. The U.S. has spent the last century treating Latin America as its exclusive sphere of influence. The Monroe Doctrine, the Cold War interventions, the war on drugs, all of it was built on the assumption that Washington could dictate the region's security architecture. But that era is over. Today, Venezuela is a proxy battleground, a place where Russia and China are testing how far they can push before the U.S. pushes back. And here's the they're winning. Take the recent deal between Venezuela and Iran. In 2022, Caracas and Tehran signed a 20-year cooperation agreement, including provisions for military and intelligence sharing. Iran has already sent drones and technicians to Venezuela, and there are reports that Hezbollah operatives are using the country as a base for operations in the region. This isn't just about oil or sanctions evasion, it's about creating a network of anti-American alliances that can operate with impunity. Now, the Biden administration has tried to walk a fine line. They've kept the sanctions in place but also engaged in back-channel talks with Maduro, offering limited sanctions relief in exchange for electoral concessions. It's a pragmatic approach, but it's also a sign of weakness. Because every time the U.S. negotiates with Maduro, it legitimizes his regime. And every time it offers concessions, it emboldens other adversaries like Nicaragua's Daniel Ortega or Cuba's Miguel Diaz-Canel to dig in deeper. So where does this leave us? The U.S. is caught between two bad options. On one hand, it can double down on coercion, tightening sanctions and threatening military action. But that risks pushing Venezuela even further into the arms of Russia and China. On the other hand, it can accept the reality of Maduro's survival and try to manage the crisis through diplomacy. But that means acknowledging that the U.S. no longer calls the shots in its own hemisphere. This is the new normal. The era of American hegemony in Latin America is over. And the question now is whether the U.S. can adapt or whether it will keep clinging to the same failed strategies, hoping for a different result. Let me be, this isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the future of U.S. power in the 21st century. If Washington can't manage a crisis in its own backyard, what does that say about its ability to compete with China in the Pacific or Russia in Eastern Europe? The answer is uncomfortable. It says that the U.S. is no longer the undisputed superpower it once was. And that's a reality the foreign policy establishment is still struggling to accept. So what comes next? The most likely scenario is a prolonged stalemate, Maduro clinging to power, the opposition fragmented, the economy in ruins, and the U.S. stuck in a cycle of half measures and empty threats. But there's also a darker that Venezuela becomes a failed state, a narco-state, a haven for transnational criminal organizations and terrorist groups. And if that happens, the spillover effects will be felt across the region, from Colombia to Mexico to the U.S. southern border. The choices we make now will determine which path we take. And that's why this moment in Venezuela isn't just the end of an era. It's a warning. A warning that the old rules no longer apply. And that if we don't change our approach, we're going to keep losing. Now, what most people don't realize is that this stalemate isn't just a product of Maduro's stubbornness or US policy failures, though both are very real. It's also the result of a fundamental shift in how power works in Venezuela itself. The old political class, the one that dominated the country for decades, is gone. The opposition that once rallied around figures like Leopoldo Lopez or Enrique Capriles is fractured, exhausted, and increasingly irrelevant. The younger generation, the one that came of age under Chavismo, doesn't remember the pre-1998 Venezuela. They don't romanticize the old Punto Fijo system or the two-party dominance of AD and COPI. For them, the choice isn't between democracy and authoritarianism, it's between survival and collapse. And that changes everything. Let me explain why this matters. The opposition strategy for the past 2 decades has been built on two: first, that the military would eventually turn on Maduro, and second, that the international community, particularly the US, would deliver regime change. Neither of those things happened. The military didn't fracture in any meaningful way, despite repeated US attempts to incentivize defections. The most high-profile case, General Raúl Baduel, who helped restore Chávez to power in 2002 before turning against him, died in prison in 2021 under suspicious circumstances. Others, like former intelligence chief Hugo Carvajal, defected only to be extradited to the US and imprisoned. The message was betrayal comes with a price. And for most officers, the calculus was simple: loyalty to the regime, no matter how corrupt or incompetent, was safer than the alternative. As for the international community, the US did everything short of invasion and sanctions, recognition of Juan Guaidó as interim president, even a botched coup attempt in 2019. But none of it worked. The European Union, once a reliable partner in pressuring Maduro, has quietly shifted its stance. In January 2023, the EU stopped recognizing Guaidó's parallel government, a move that was as symbolic as it was practical. The Lima Group, the regional coalition that once coordinated pressure on Venezuela, is effectively dead. Even Colombia's Gustavo Petro, who came to power in 2022 promising a new approach, has opted for engagement over confrontation. The result? Maduro is more entrenched than ever, and the opposition is left with nothing but empty gestures. Here's the uncomfortable: the opposition's failure isn't just tactical, it's existential. They've been playing by the rules of a game that no longer exists. The old playbook, mass protests, international pressure, military defections, assumed that Venezuela was still a functioning state with institutions that could be leveraged. But Venezuela in 2024 isn't the same country it was in 2014, or even 2019. The state has been hollowed out. The National Assembly, once a bastion of opposition power, is now a rubber stamp body controlled by Maduro's allies. The judiciary is a joke. The Electoral Council is a tool of the regime. And the military, far from being a neutral arbiter, is deeply embedded in the country's criminal economy, from gold mining in the south to drug trafficking in the west. So what does the opposition do now? The most likely scenario is that they fracture further. The moderate wing, led by figures like Capriles, will continue to push for negotiations, hoping that Maduro might eventually agree to some cosmetic reforms in exchange for sanctions relief. The hardliners, meanwhile, will keep calling for more pressure, more sanctions, more isolation. But neither approach is likely to work. Maduro has no incentive to negotiate in good faith, and the US has no appetite for another round of failed talks. The last attempt, the 2021 Mexico City negotiations, collapsed after Maduro's allies walked out, accusing the opposition of bad faith. Since then, the regime has only tightened its grip. But there's another possibility, one that's rarely discussed in Washington or Brussels. What if the opposition simply ceases to exist as a coherent political force? Not in the sense that it disappears entirely, but in the sense that it becomes irrelevant. That's already happening in some ways. The younger generation, the one that should be the opposition's future, is either leaving the country or disengaging from politics entirely. The 2023 municipal elections, which the opposition boycotted, saw turnout below 30%. That's not just apathy, it's a rejection of the entire political system. And if that trend continues, Maduro won't need to repress the opposition because there won't be one left to repress. Now, let's talk about the economy, because that's where the real story is. The narrative in Washington is that sanctions are working, that Maduro is on the ropes, that one more push will bring him down. But the data tells a different story. Venezuela's GDP grew by an estimated 4% in 2023, the first real growth in a decade. Inflation, while still high, has fallen from its peak of over 1,000,000% in 2018 to around 200% in 2023. The bolivar, which was effectively worthless, has stabilized somewhat. And most importantly, oil production, Venezuela's lifeblood, has ticked up to around 800,000 barrels per day, still far below its peak of 3.5 million but enough to keep the regime afloat. How is this possible? 2. Sanctions relief. In 2022, the U.S. quietly loosened some of its oil sanctions, allowing Chevron to resume limited operations in Venezuela. In 2023, it went further, issuing licenses to European firms like Repsol and Eni to export Venezuelan oil. The result? Maduro got just enough breathing room to keep the economy from collapsing entirely. And here's the U.S. did this not because it wanted to help Maduro, but because it needed Venezuelan oil to offset the loss of Russian supplies after the invasion of Ukraine. That's the irony of the situation. The same sanctions that were supposed to strangle the regime ended up being used as a bargaining chip in a global energy crisis. But don't mistake this for a recovery. Venezuela's economy is still a shadow of what it was. The growth we're seeing is from an extremely low base, and it's driven almost entirely by the oil sector. The rest of the economy, manufacturing, agriculture, services, is still in shambles. Hyperinflation may have eased, but wages remain abysmal. The minimum wage is less than $10 a month. A teacher in Venezuela earns about $20 a month. A doctor? Maybe $30. That's not a living wage, it's a starvation wage. And that's why the exodus continues. Over 7 million Venezuelans have fled the country since 2015, the largest displacement crisis in the Western Hemisphere. And that number isn't going down anytime soon. So where does this leave us? The most likely scenario is what I call the zombie state scenario. Venezuela won't collapse, but it won't recover either. It will limp along, kept alive by just enough oil revenue to prevent total catastrophe, but not enough to fix its underlying problems. Maduro will remain in power, but his rule will be increasingly personalized, increasingly reliant on repression and patronage. The opposition will continue to exist, but it will be a shell of its former self, a collection of exiles and disillusioned activists with no real power. And the U.S. will be stuck in a holding pattern, alternating between half-hearted sanctions and half-hearted diplomacy, never quite willing to admit that its strategy has failed. But there's another scenario, one that's far more dangerous. What if Venezuela doesn't just stagnate, what if it becomes something worse? What if it becomes a true narco-state, a hub for transnational crime, a launching pad for instability across the region? We're already seeing the early signs. The Cartel of the Suns, a criminal network embedded in the Venezuelan military, is one of the most powerful drug trafficking organizations in the world. In 2020, the U.S. indicted Nicolas Maduro himself on drug trafficking charges, accusing him of conspiring to flood the United States with cocaine. And it's not just drugs. Venezuela has become a key transit point for illegal gold, weapons, and even human trafficking. The Colombian guerrilla group ELN operates freely in Venezuelan territory, as do dissident factions of the FARC. And let's not forget Hezbollah, which has long used Venezuela as a base for its operations in Latin America. If this trend continues, Venezuela could become a black hole of instability, sucking in the entire region. Colombia, already struggling with its own internal conflicts, would be the first to feel the effects. But the ripple effects would spread much further. Mexico's cartels, always looking for new routes and new partners, would see Venezuela as an opportunity. The U.S. southern border, already a flashpoint, would become even more chaotic. And the international criminal networks that operate in Venezuela, Russian oligarchs, Chinese triads, Middle Eastern militant groups, would have a safe haven in the heart of the Americas. Here's the none of this is inevitable. But preventing it will require a fundamental rethink of how we approach Venezuela. The old strategies, sanctions, isolation, regime change, have failed. They've failed because they were based on a flawed understanding of the problem. Venezuela isn't Cuba. It's not Nicaragua. It's not even the Venezuela of 2014. It's a country that has been hollowed out by corruption, mismanagement, and external pressure. And the only way to fix it is to accept that reality. That means engaging with Maduro, not because he deserves it, but because there's no other way. It means offering sanctions relief in exchange for real concessions, free and fair elections, the release of political prisoners, and end to the criminalization of dissent. It means working with regional partners like Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico to create a unified approach, rather than relying on the US to dictate the terms. And it means accepting that the opposition, as it exists today, is not the solution. A new political force will have to emerge, one that speaks to the realities of Venezuela in 2024, not the fantasies of 2014. But here's the: none of this will happen unless the US changes its approach. And right now, there's no sign that it will. The foreign policy establishment is still trapped in the same old mindset, the same old assumptions. They still believe that if they just apply enough pressure, Maduro will fall. They still believe that the opposition is the key to Venezuela's future. They still believe that the US can dictate the outcome. And until they let go of those beliefs, Venezuela will keep sliding toward the abyss. This moment in Venezuela isn't just the end of an era. It's a test. A test of whether the US can adapt to a world where it's no longer the sole superpower. A test of whether it can accept that its influence in Latin America is waning. And a test of whether it's willing to try something new, or whether it will keep clinging to the same failed strategies, hoping for a different result. So far, the signs aren't encouraging. But the clock is ticking. And the longer we wait, the harder it will be to pull Venezuela back from the brink.